No suicide note, no drugs, no warning signs. In 2018, Anthony Bourdain was found dead, alone in a hotel room in France, while the film crew waited outside, and his shooting schedule for the coming months was already locked in. A man who had traveled to more than 80 countries, who spoke openly about war, poverty, violence, and the quiet suffering of humanity, chose to end his life in a silence so complete it left no explanation behind. When someone who had seen nearly the entire world still decided to leave it without a word, what was heavy enough to finally break Anthony Bourdain? In the years before his death, Anthony Bourdain had reached a place most people spend their entire lives chasing. After Kitchen Confidential exploded in the early 2000s, his voice cut through food culture like a blade, raw, unsentimental, honest. Then television followed. No reservations turned him into a global storyteller. Parts unknown pushed even further, dropping him into war zones, slums, refugee camps, and forgotten corners of the map, where he didn't just eat, he listened. By the mid-2010s, Bourdain had filmed in more than 80 countries, won multiple Emmy Awards, and built an audience counted in tens of millions across CNN and beyond. He wasn't selling luxury. He wasn't chasing glamour. He was sitting on plastic stools in back alleys, sharing meals with people history had ignored, translating their pain and dignity for a comfortable Western audience. For many viewers, Bourdain became more than a host. He became a moral compass, someone who seemed fearless enough to face the world as it actually was, and articulate enough to make sense of it. Every episode reinforced the same image: a man who had survived addiction, outrun his demons, and finally figured life out on his own terms. And that was the version the world believed in: the seasoned traveler, the clear-eyed truth-teller, the man who had seen everything and wasn't afraid anymore. But when a person is elevated into proof that survival is possible, what happens when they quietly stop believing their own story? Anthony Bourdain was born in 1956 in New York City, into a family that appeared stable, educated, and secure, which is why his earliest wounds were never obvious enough to be named. There was no single trauma, no dramatic rupture that could later be blamed for what came after. What shaped him instead was a quieter condition, a persistent sense of emotional distance. Even as a child, Bourdain learned to observe rather than participate, to stay alert in rooms without fully belonging to them. That habit of standing slightly apart from his own life would never leave him. One of the earliest moments he later identified as formative came through food. While traveling with his family, he tasted an oyster for the first time, an experience he would describe as a sudden crossing of a line. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about independence, about stepping into something unsupervised and real. Food became more than nourishment. It became a doorway out of a world that felt safe but emotionally hollow, a way to assert control without confrontation. His early encounters with drugs followed the same pattern. As a teenager, Bourdain wasn't chasing rebellion or chaos. He was drawn to the silent substances created in his mind. Drugs softened his thoughts, muted his constant self-awareness, and offered brief relief from attention he didn't yet have words for. For the first time, he could exist without overthinking his own existence. That relief was subtle, but it taught him something dangerous. Escape didn't require running away. It could happen internally, quietly, without anyone noticing. Detachment slowly became his armor. Sarcasm, dark humor, and intellectual distance were not stylistic choices, but survival tools. He learned to analyze discomfort before it could reach him, to translate emotion instead of experiencing it. Vulnerability felt unsafe. Control felt necessary. Over time, this posture hardened into identity. Bourdain became someone who could speak eloquently about pain, as long as it belonged to someone else. As he moved toward adulthood, that restlessness never resolved. He functioned, advanced, and survived, but never described himself as grounded. There was always a sense that real life was happening somewhere else. By the time he entered the professional kitchen world, the psychological foundation was already set. The chaos, pressure, and excess didn't create his coping mechanisms. They rewarded them. What looked like toughness was often numbness, and what looked like belonging was simply familiarity with discomfort. When emotional distance becomes your first language, how do you ever learn to come home to yourself? Anthony Bourdain did not enter the kitchen because he dreamed of becoming a chef. He entered because it offered structure without emotional exposure. Professional kitchens were loud, brutal, hierarchical, and exhausting, but they were also clear. You showed up, you endured, you survived the night. For someone who had spent his life managing internal distance, that clarity felt grounding. The kitchen didn't ask him to explain himself. It only demanded performance. The culture he walked into was unforgiving. Long shifts that blurred into mornings. Screaming, humiliation, and pressure treated as training. Alcohol and drugs woven into the rhythm of service. Not as vices, but as tools to keep going. In that environment, Bourdain didn't stand out because of excess. He blended in. His capacity for endurance, his ability to detach emotionally and keep moving, were rewarded. What would have looked like self-destruction elsewhere passed as toughness behind the line. Drugs became routine rather than rebellion. They helped him manage exhaustion, dull anxiety, and maintain control in a space where mistakes were punished immediately and publicly. Addiction didn't arrive as a collapse. It arrived as maintenance, as a way to stay functional inside a system that demanded constant output and offered very little care in return. He wasn't trying to escape work. He was trying to survive it. Over time, the kitchen became both refuge and trap. It gave him identity, purpose, and a sense of belonging he hadn't found elsewhere. But it also normalized numbness. Emotional shutdown was not only accepted, it was encouraged. Pain was something you worked through, not something you examined. Vulnerability slowed service. Reflection got in the way. The faster you moved, the less you had to feel. Bourdain learned the language of this world fluently. He adopted its cynicism, its dark humor, its contempt for weakness. That voice would later make him famous as a writer, but it was forged in an environment that mistook survival for strength. Each year in the kitchen reinforced the same lesson. If you keep moving, no one will ask how you're really doing. When he finally began writing, it wasn't an act of ambition. It was release. He wrote the way kitchens operated. Direct, unsentimental, sharp. Kitchen Confidential didn't romanticize the profession. It exposed it. The drugs, the egos, the violence, the exhaustion. And because he told the truth without pretending to be better than it, people listened. The book hit a nerve because it wasn't crafted for approval. It was written by someone who had lived inside the chaos long enough to describe it without illusion. But success didn't dismantle the habits the kitchen had taught him. It amplified them. Writing and later television rewarded the same traits. Constant motion, relentless output, emotional distance framed as insight. Bourdain became known as a truth teller, someone unafraid to look at ugly realities. Yet that role required him to stay sharp, detached, and perpetually in control. The same coping mechanisms that once kept him alive now followed him into fame. The kitchen had trained him well. It taught him how to endure pain, how to keep going without complaint, how to translate suffering into something useful. What it never taught him was how to stop. When your entire identity is built around surviving pressure, what happens when the pressure never ends and survival is no longer enough? When Anthony Bourdain crossed from kitchens into television, the transformation was fast and deceptively clean. No reservations didn't just make him recognizable. It made him necessary. By the mid-2000s, he was another food host chasing ratings. He was the anti-host, the man who refused polish, who smoked, swore, questioned power, and sat comfortably with discomfort. As the show expanded, so did his authority. Viewers didn't tune in to watch him eat. They tuned in to hear what he thought about the world. Then came Parts Unknown, and the mask hardened into legend. The format pushed him into places most television avoided. War zones, refugee camps, failed states, post-conflict cities, still bleeding under the surface. He wasn't there to explain cuisine. He was there to frame human pain in a way audiences could absorb. The camera followed him through Beirut, Congo, Libya, Gaza. Each episode reinforced the same image. Bourdain as witness. Bourdain as truth teller. Bourdain as someone unafraid to look directly at what others edited out. By the early 2010s, his reach had grown massive. Millions watched. Awards followed. Emmys piled up. His voice carried weight not just in food culture, but in politics, ethics, and global conversation. When Bourdain spoke, people listened because he sounded like someone who had survived things. someone who had already made peace with darkness. The world didn't see a man searching for answers. It saw a man who had already found them. But fame didn't quiet his inner tension. It sharpened it. Television demanded repetition, insight on schedule, authenticity packaged into seasons. The more successful he became, the less room there was to be uncertain. Viewers expected clarity. Networks expected consistency. The man who once used distance to survive now had performed distance as wisdom. He wasn't allowed to unravel. He was expected to interpret unraveling for others. Off camera, the pace was relentless. Constant travel. Jet lag layered over exhaustion. Hotels blurred together. Airports became home. There was no time to process what he witnessed because the next location was always waiting. Suffering became content. Empathy became labor. The mask he wore on screen, calm, ironic, controlled, was no longer optional. It was a job. What made this phase especially dangerous was how convincing the image became. Even to him, Bourdain had built a version of himself the world admired. A man who had survived addiction, conquered kitchens, and mastered meaning. That version left no room for fragility. Admitting doubt would have shattered the myth. And so the mask stayed on, even when it grew heavy. When your public identity is built on the idea that you understand the world better than most, where you go when a world starts to feel unbearable again. By the time Anthony Bourdain reached the peak of his public influence, the collapse had already begun, quietly, internally, without spectacle. There was no single scandal, no sudden relapse splashed across headlines, no obvious breaking point the world could point at later and say, that's when it went wrong. What unraveled instead was something far harder to detect, a gradual erosion of meaning. The very thing that once sustained him, travel, storytelling, bearing witness, began to lose its power. Years of constant movement had stripped routine from his life. Hotels replaced homes. Airports replaced community. Relationships became intermittent, fragile, conducted across time zones and exhaustion. He spent more nights alone than anyone realized, not in dramatic isolation, but in repetition. Same room, same silence, same sense of being suspended between places without truly belonging to any of them. The travel that once felt liberating now felt compulsory. Stopping meant confronting stillness, and stillness was something he had spent his entire life avoiding. The emotional toll of the work deepened as well. Parts unknown pushed him into places saturated with suffering. Countries recovering from war, communities crushed by poverty, people living under systems designed to erase them. Early on, these encounters gave him purpose. He could contextualize pain. He could translate it. He could give it dignity through attention. But over time, the accumulation became heavy. Trauma was no longer something he visited. It was something he carried with him, episode after episode, without time or space to set it down. What made this burden particularly dangerous was a role he had been assigned. Bourdain wasn't just witnessing suffering. He was expected to make sense of it. Viewers didn't want despair. They wanted clarity, insight, perspective. Every episode required him to enter darkness and return with meaning neatly packaged. That expectation slowly inverted the relationship he had with his own pain. There was room to analyze the world's wounds, but very little room to acknowledge his own. His job was to explain, not to be confused. At the same time, his identity had become inseparable from his voice. The cynical wisdom, the moral authority, the man who had seen too much to be naive. That persona didn't allow for collapse. It didn't allow for confusion. If he admitted that the stories were no longer enough, that the meaning was thinning, he risked dismantling the very foundation of his relevance. And so he continued, even as the work began to feel hollow in ways he struggled to articulate. Privately, signs of emotional fatigue became harder to ignore. Friends noticed fluctuations in mood, stretches of withdrawal, a heaviness that didn't lift easily. But Bourdain was skilled at deflection. Humor, sarcasm, work, movement. These were not new strategies. They were refined versions of patterns he had relied on since childhood. The difference now was scale. The demands were larger, the stakes were higher, and the margin for vulnerability was smaller than ever. What made this phase especially deceptive was how successful it looked from the outside. Ratings remained strong. Awards continued. Invitations multiplied to the world. He appeared fully realized, a man who had turned chaos into clarity. But internally, the questions were growing louder. What happens when the stories no longer heal the storyteller? When the act of explaining suffering stops providing relief and begins to deepen it? This was not a sudden descent. It was a slow fracture, spreading beneath the surface of a life that still looked intact. And once meaning starts to fail quietly and persistently, what replaces it before the damage becomes irreversible? As the fracture widened, it began to attach itself to the most intimate areas of Anthony Bourdain's life. What once felt like controlled distance turned into emotional volatility. His relationships, always complicated by travel and intensity, became increasingly unstable. He had spent decades learning how to leave rooms without being noticed. Now he found himself afraid of being left instead. That fear didn't arrive dramatically. It crept in through exhaustion, insecurity, and the quiet panic of aging inside a culture that worships momentum. The relationship that marked his final years intensified everything that was already unstable. It pulled him out of his practiced detachment and forced him into emotional exposure he wasn't equipped to manage. Passion replaced routine. Obsession replaced balance. For someone who had survived by controlling distance, this sudden closeness felt both intoxicating and terrifying. He was no longer observing emotion. He was inside it without armor. And when cracks appeared, they cut deeper than anything he had experienced before. Publicly, he remained composed. Privately, his sense of self began to erode. He became more reactive, more sensitive to criticism, more visibly affected by online backlash and public judgment. Social media, which he had once used as a platform for sharp commentary, turned into a mirror he couldn't escape. Every post invited interpretation. Every silence invited speculation. The man who once framed narratives for millions now found himself trapped inside narratives he could no longer control. At the same time, the physical toll of years on the road caught up with him. Sleep was irregular. Jet lag became constant. Recovery grew harder. The body that once endured punishment as proof of resilience began to signal limits he didn't know how to respect. He had built an identity around endurance, around pushing through discomfort, around never stopping long enough to feel. Slowing down felt like surrender, and surrender felt like failure. The most dangerous shift, however, happened internally. The questions that once drove his work. Who are these people? How do they survive? What does their suffering mean? Began to turn inward without offering answers. He had spent his life explaining the world's pain in ways that felt honest and humane. But when it came to his own, the language failed him. Insight didn't bring relief. Awareness didn't bring peace. Understanding, for the first time, felt insufficient. Friends and colleagues sensed something was wrong. But Bourdain had always been skilled at managing concern. He deflected with humor. He changed the subject. He kept moving. The schedule remained full. The cameras kept rolling. From the outside, nothing appeared broken enough to stop the machine. From the inside, the machinery was grinding him down. What made this period especially lethal was the absence of visible crisis. There was no relapse into addiction that demanded intervention, no public breakdown that forced pause. He was functioning, productive, engaged, and that functionality became camouflage. It allowed the slow collapse to continue unchecked. The world assumed strength because it saw output. It mistook presence for stability. By early 2018, the erosion had reached a point where rest no longer restored him. Travel no longer distracted him. Work no longer insulated him. The tools he relied on for decades, movement, irony, productivity, stopped working. He was left alone with the very thing he had spent his life outrunning: stillness. And in that stillness, the questions returned without answers. What happens when you no longer believe the stories you tell? When the meaning you extract for others no longer sustains you? In June of that year, while filming yet another episode, surrounded by a familiar crew and a familiar routine, he reached the end of his strategies. There was no dramatic goodbye, no announcement, no explanation, just a decision made quietly, in a space where no audience could interpret it and no narrative could contain it. The same man who had translated the world's suffering for millions left without translating his own. This was not a moment of impulse. It was a final stage of a long internal failure, one built on endurance without repair, insight without refuge, and identity without rest. When meaning erodes slowly enough, it doesn't feel like collapse, it feels like exhaustion. And when exhaustion replaces hope, how does anyone recognize the point of no return before it's already passed? After Anthony Bourdain died, the world reacted the only way it knew how, with noise. Headlines spread in minutes. Tributes flooded social media. Clips resurfaced. Quotes were reposted as if repetition could reverse the outcome. Millions of people spoke at once, each trying to explain what his life had meant to them, and in doing so, revealing just how deeply he had entered their inner worlds. What followed was an unusual kind of mourning, not just grief for a celebrity, but confusion over a contradiction no one knew how to resolve. Bourdain had become a guide for navigating complexity. He had taught viewers how to sit with discomfort, how to respect cultures without romanticizing them, how to acknowledge pain without exploiting it. His death felt like a violation of that contract. If someone who understood the world so clearly could still choose to leave it, what did that say about the advice he had spent decades offering? In the months that followed, colleagues and friends spoke carefully. Many emphasized his generosity, his curiosity, his refusal to simplify human beings into stereotypes. Others admitted quietly that they had underestimated how much he carried. The same traits that made him compelling on screen, intensity, honesty, emotional depth, had also made him vulnerable. He absorbed stories the way others absorb trauma, without ever fully releasing them. The world had praised his openness, but openness without protection comes at a cost. Parts unknown ended, unfinished in a way that felt appropriate. There was no clean conclusion, no final statement to frame his journey. The absence became part of the legacy. Unlike other public figures whose lives end with a clear moral or cautionary lesson, Bourdain left behind ambiguity, and that ambiguity resisted closure. Viewers returned to his work not to find answers, but to sit inside the questions he never resolved. What remained most striking was how many people described a deeply personal connection to him, despite never having met him. He had a way of speaking directly to those who felt displaced, restless, or skeptical of easy optimism. He didn't promise happiness. He promised honesty. For many, that was enough. His voice had offered permission to feel conflicted, to admit that understanding the world doesn't automatically make it easier to live in. But legacy is not built only on what someone gives to others. It is also shaped by what their absence exposes. Bourdain's death forced a conversation that had long been avoided. The cost of turning insight into identity. When a person becomes valued primarily for their ability to interpret pain, where does that pain go when it belongs to them? Who notices when the observer needs help? His life highlighted a cultural blind spot, our tendency to confuse articulation with resolution and wisdom with immunity. In the years since, his work has continued to resonate because it resists simplification. He didn't sell redemption arcs. He didn't offer transformation narratives wrapped in hope. He showed people as they were, contradictory, wounded, resilient, and unfinished. That refusal to tidy up reality is why his absence still feels present. His voice didn't fade because it was never designed to reassure. It was designed to confront. There is something deeply human in the way his story ends. Not instructive, not exemplary, just human. A reminder that clarity does not cancel suffering, and empathy does not guarantee safety. Bourdain understood the world with extraordinary precision, but understanding did not spare him from exhaustion. His life stands as evidence that meaning can be created, shared, and still feel insufficient when carried alone. Perhaps his true legacy is not found in the places he visited or the awards he won, but in the discomfort he left behind, the unresolved tension between insight and survival, the quiet warning embedded in a life that looked complete but wasn't. He showed millions how to look honestly at the world. His absence asked something harder: how to look honestly at ourselves, even when we would rather keep moving. When the camera turns off, when the travel ends, and when the stories stop coming, what remains is not the role we play for others, but the weight we carried alone. And if a man who spent his life listening so carefully still reached a point where silence felt unbearable, what does that say about the spaces we leave unguarded inside ourselves? Anthony Bourdain's story does not close cleanly, and that may be the most honest ending it could have. There is no lesson neatly wrapped in hope, No final revelation that explains everything away. What remains instead is a quiet unease, the kind that lingers after the screen fades to black. He spent his life teaching people to sit with discomfort, to resist easy answers, to accept that the world is complicated and often cruel. In the end, his own life demanded the same kind of acceptance. It is tempting to turn his death into a warning or a symbol or a moral checkpoint. But doing so risks repeating the same mistake that followed him for years, reducing a human being into a role. Bourdain was not a guide meant to save others at the cost of himself. He was a man who endured, who observed, who translated meaning as long as he could, until the weight of carrying it alone became too heavy. His silence at the end was not a message. It was exhaustion. What his story exposes is something deeply uncomfortable about how we relate to people like him. We admire those who articulate pain clearly. We reward those who can sit in darkness and return with insight, and then we assume they're immune to the very forces they describe. Bourdain showed the world how suffering works across cultures, across borders, across history. What he never found was a safe place to put his own. His legacy lives on not because he offered answers, but because he refused to lie. He showed people as they were. He acknowledged contradictions without trying to resolve them. And in doing so, he gave viewers permission to feel lost without pretending that being lost was temporary. That honesty is why his work still feels alive, even now. It doesn't comfort. It stays with you. Perhaps the hardest truth his life leaves behind is this: understanding the world does not guarantee peace within it. Insight can coexist with despair. Empathy can deepen pain as much as it alleviates it. And survival, when built entirely on endurance, eventually runs out of strength. Bourdain survived longer than many expected. He just didn't survive forever. When everything has been said, written, filmed, and shared, what remains is a quiet question his story refuses to answer for us. Not why he died, but how we live with the knowledge that even the most perceptive voices can disappear without warning. When the person who listened to everyone finally needed someone to listen to him, who was really there? And if a man who spent his life searching for meaning in the world still reached a point where meaning was no longer enough, what does that ask of us when we feel the same silence beginning to grow?